Well, it is so nice to have you with me today. This is video number 8 in an 8-part series on the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Hopefully you've joined me for the previous videos, but if this is the first one you're watching, hope you find it helpful. Today we're going to focus on the outcome of the Enlightenment, and so we'll get started with that right now. Now, there's a lot of different things we can talk about with the impact of the Enlightenment, both really at the time and then thinking forward. So we'll just touch on a few things, and that'll wrap up this video series. Right, so first of all, one thing about this time period, getting into the 1700s, is ideas were able to spread pretty quickly. The printing press had been around for a long time at this point. So if there was information out there that was of any interest to anybody, it was pretty easy to get it from point A to point B. And didn't matter who you were as a philosoph, if you got some ideas out there, if they got put down on paper and were able to circulate, anybody could get a hold of them. So upper class people gained access to some of these ideas and certainly had their thoughts about it. Middle class people, and at this point, middle class people is more a reference to wealthy people than we probably think of today. But the biggest thing is it wasn't just royalty, for example, that had access to ideas and information. More and more people throughout society were beginning to get access to different ideas. And not surprisingly, people that were outside of the traditional power structure were definitely open to thinking about things differently than how things had been before. And so also along with this was just growing literacy generally. And the more people who were able to read about these ideas, the more people that were potentially impacted and influenced by them. So a really big idea to come from Enlightenment thought was an overall belief in progress. You actually see this even before the Enlightenment, going back to the beginnings of the Scientific Revolution, really a century or two before. What people were able to see happening in the natural sciences, especially getting into the 1700s, was just better and better understanding about how the world worked, whether it was the sun and the stars and the earth, or whether it was biology, chemistry, you name it. What there is to understand, people were getting a much better and a much more accurate understanding of things. And as people saw us, people, getting a much better understanding of the natural world, it sure seemed like if you used the same kinds of principles that made science work, observation, reason, logic, that if you could apply those same kinds of principles to society, that the problems that existed in society could in fact be solved. Now, one thing that's important to note, many of these, in fact, most of these Enlightenment thinkers, these philosophers, were not necessarily big-time activists and agents of actual change themselves. They were theorists, they were idea people. That's not to diminish them, but they themselves maybe didn't see the impact of their ideas necessarily in their lifetime, but those ideas would be impactful, certainly as time went by. And some of the problems they were seeing in society as philosophers would slowly but surely begin to be solved, in some places more than others. Right. Another big thing that came through Enlightenment ideas, and this was something that was building to a certain degree already, but really began to develop during the Enlightenment years and beyond, was a more secular outlook. And when we're talking about a secular outlook, that would be a non-religious outlook, is at least one way of putting it. Religion and faith had for centuries been a huge part of people's lives, especially if we're focusing in on Europe, like we are at this point in time. And people had basically been asked to take at face value what the church had said. And through things like the Scientific Revolution and now this developing Enlightenment thought related to society, people were beginning to see that at least some of what the church had to say about things wasn't necessarily accurate. And so, for starters, people were much more apt to question religion, to question church, and to question beliefs of the church, why things were done the way they were, and not just say, well, this is how it is, and so there you go, it's good and right because this is how it is. And And in some cases, the church was able to answer some of those questions. In many cases, probably not so much. But whether the church or anybody else for that matter could answer some of these faith-based questions, people wanted more of an explanation. And this wasn't necessarily out of a desire to eliminate faith and spirituality or religion, really out of a desire to understand. Now, one of the effects was it did cause people to question God and question either his existence or his role in everything. And some people certainly would turn away from the church. But for many, they just wanted to understand more. And so that was a big part of Enlightenment influence moving forward, is just a desire to understand, which was very different than what had been true before. And then another really big idea that really came through Enlightenment ideas, the individual and the emphasis on the individual. For the longest time, people didn't really think for themselves very much. People generally relied on whether it was the church or whether it was the non-church leaders in wherever it was that they lived to basically make decisions on their behalf. And through Enlightenment thought, through thinking about things differently, people began to take the approach of it was okay to use their own mind, that problems that existed for them could potentially be solved by their own thoughts and their own efforts. They didn't necessarily have to count on somebody else to solve their problems for them. And one of the areas where we see some changes begin to develop through this type of thinking is economic thought began to change. In particular, you take a person like Adam Smith and some of his ideas consistent with capitalism. He believed that when people work for their own self-interest, when people are focused on what is going to be good for them and what is going to make their own situations better, that if you have everybody working this way, that's how you're going to actually get the greatest amount of progress. It might be a little bit counterintuitive. You might think people are all self-interested, that sounds like selfishness and that would actually hurt things. But when you have people that have self-interest, if there's certain things that they want to achieve and they need support from other people, or they need this resource or that resource or this tool or that tool, what people tend to find is if they can work together in complementary ways, lots of people can actually move forward in the ways that they want to for themselves, all the while supporting one another at the same time. And so that was a perspective that really began to develop at this time. Out of self-interest, people could make progress and begin to solve a lot of their own problems. And then finally, just the overall idea that reason became the order of the day. That as people thought about society, how it operated, what was going on within society, that things that they didn't like, things that they saw as problematic, it didn't have to stay that way. That if they identified problems in society, like slavery, for example, many of the philosophes saw slavery as a terrible, terrible thing. And though they maybe didn't get slavery to change in their lifetime, the advocacy for changing institutions like that would eventually become significant for enough people to actually bring about those changes. I think that's one of the things that can be really hard for us even today. We don't have a lot of patience when we have identified a problem, that once we identify a problem, we really want it to go away and be solved immediately, which is great. It'd be wonderful if every problem that we encountered could be solved immediately. But I think it's important to recognize that if history is a guide, step one, if you want to call it step one, is identifying a problem. Step two is then working to solve it. And most of the time, it does take some time to solve even the most obvious of problems. And it's important to remember that until you identify the problem and desire for things to change, it's not going to change. As long as you can be on the path towards things changing that need to change, you'll get there eventually. Well, I hope you've found these videos helpful in this series on the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. I appreciate you joining me for each of these. And like I said, I hope it's been helpful, useful. Thanks for watching.